Okay, welcome to this evening's Virtual Design Jam panel event where we're going to be talking all things B Corp and ethical business models. Tonight we're joined with Phil Orr from 25/8 and Bryce Magnuson from Federation University and Straight and Arrow. Thanks for joining us this evening, Phil and Bryce.
Cheers, Scott. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Before we commence, guys, I'm just going to do a quick acknowledgement of country. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land of which we gather and meet, which for me it's the Gunai Kurnai, today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people that might be in the audience today. Okay, so as we jump into our discussion, we might kick off with a bit of an introduction, Phil and Bryce, just about the work that you've both been doing. Phil in the B Corp space and Bryce in the ethical modelling space. Would you like to just give the attendees a bit of background about the work that you've been doing, please?
Sure, I'll let Phil go first on this one.
Okay, I'm trying to be a gentleman, but that's fine. Hello to everybody who's watching. So my name's Phil Orr. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which is where I am currently, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My company, which I started alongside my business partner, Samantha Hurley, I think 6 years ago now, is called 25/8. And 25/8 is basically an education, training and implementation companies. What we focus on is trying to help time-poor business leaders adopt innovative practices. It came from the fact of days previously working in agencies and stuff where people wanted to always keep all their secret herbs and spices to themselves and not upskill people to do the things themselves. And working with startups and small businesses, recognised there was a real need to help people along their own learning journey. So what was Marketing Entourage became 25/8. And during this journey, having met Sam, we've become a B Corp, which at Sam, I can quite honestly say this would have never happened without Sam. But we were talking about who would speak, and I can speak firsthand about not being very knowledgeable at the start and literally having to always Google what is a B Corp to now where I'm blessed to be part of a growing and a thriving B Corp, to be part of this amazing community, and also be on the B Corp Climate Collective Steering Committee in Australia, which again has been an amazing learning journey, but a great thing. So I'm here today to almost share my personal journey and some of the challenges that come on the way, but also the outcomes that can come from being part of this amazing community.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Phil. And I'll pass it over to you, Bryce.
Yeah, sure. So for me, where I sort of sit within this space, I run a little screen printing company called Straight and Arrow out of Moe/Newborough here in Gippsland. The way that came about was when I started doing my PhD, I was focusing on ethical clothing. And I could go back a few more steps beyond that and talk about how when I was an undergrad student, as a second year marketing student, I was just completely, I'm trying to think of a polite word that I can use, but I was basically over marketing, which is a really strange thing to then sit here as a lecturer within marketing. But I just sort of had enough of all these big organizations and the way they were presented. And it was a case of, these are the big organizations that you'll go and work for when you graduate. And, they're talking about organizations that just didn't really resonate with me. And then these were companies that I'd regularly hear about doing things that maybe weren't all that great. And that would be across a number of fronts, like ethically, environmentally, socially, whatever else. So that's sort of, I think in hindsight, that is what then set me on that path to eventually, when I was looking at postgrad, I thought, yeah, look, ethical clothing is this area that I really want to work in. And I realized that if I'm going to sit there and write a thesis over 4 years, I might need something else to do other than sitting in front of a screen. So I did a short screen printing course because I'd always liked graphic design and a little bit of fashion, and thought, yeah, maybe one day I'll ramp up the design side of things, and then I'll start paying someone to do the screen printing, but worked out pretty quickly I could probably do it myself. And at the time as like a first year PhD student, and by that stage I was nearly 5 years into being a university student. I didn't have a lot of money to really start anything, so I thought, well, I'll just see what I can DIY. And pretty quickly I learned that firstly I could DIY most of what I needed myself, and secondly that was probably for the best, because I learned very quickly that there were a huge number of issues associated with the clothing industry, the whole supply chain. There were problems throughout. So then straight and narrow became this thing that I was originally just sort of experimenting in that space to see like what could I do on a small scale that could be classified as ethical, and is there any scope to scale that up or whatever else. So for me, that was sort of how straight and narrow came about. It was this thing that I was doing just on the side to take the edge off my PhD, and it just became this physical manifestation and something that was only ever going to be just a hobby. I started off just printing a few shirts for friends, and your friends would look and go, oh yeah, that's really cool. Hey, do you do this? And then very quickly it was less about what I was making and more about what can you do in that space. And then it was one of those things where momentum just built momentum, and a couple of people that were really well connected come to me and said, oh, could you help us with this project and that project? And then word of mouth just spread very quickly. So that's another thing that for anyone who then might be like, oh, this is interesting, I'll try and Google this guy and find him. You actually find very little about the business online. And I've actually sort of done that a little bit on purpose because I also work full time. So it brings me to the second part of what I do in the ethical space, which is I'm a marketing lecturer with Federation University, and I'm also the prime coordinator, which is principles of responsible management education. So I'm also in a position where I get to be creating curriculum to be embedding into our courses and coming up with mechanisms to make sure that a decent amount of social responsibility and ethical considerations are actually built into what we're teaching. So I'm sort of lucky in both of my jobs. I'm working in that ethical space, and they didn't come about in the most direct way, but it's an exciting space to be in at the minute.
Wow, and thank you very much for both of your introductions there, Phil and Bryce. So, and sorry, Bryce, I didn't realize that you're in the PRME.
Yeah, that's very recent. That was only sort of 2 or 3 months ago I stepped into that role.
That's very cool, because I suppose that brings another flavor of the responsibility process in as well, which is kind of a part of tonight's conversation as well, by accident, but I think that'll work in well. So we were talking, Phil, about your journey off camera. My own experience with BCorp was through Latrobe Valley Bus Lines, which I think very early kind of jumped on the BCorp model back in 2017. And I knew very little about what BCorp was then. I then kind of found out that Torrens were aligned as a university to BCorp and thought, oh, this thing must be capturing a bit of momentum. And then I noticed that 25/8 was BCorp, and then I thought, oh, okay, we need to talk about this. How did the process start for yourself and Sam to go down that pathway?
Yeah, well, probably the best milestone was that we got certified in August 2019. But the journey to that point was probably about 2.5 years before that, of which the first year was Sam politely nudging me saying we really should be a B Corp, and then educating ourselves on what that is. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that. But then it was actually about an 18-month process to actually get that to happen and to make sure that it's done the right way. So in terms of what is a B Corp, certified B Corps are basically businesses that focus on meeting the highest standards of like social and environmental performance. It's important to have public transparency of what you're doing, and also legal accountability to balance profit and purpose. So back in 2014, I started a social enterprise, basically with a very good friend of mine, Warwick Peel, called Entrepreneurs & Co. And it was based on the foundations of a social enterprise. We've never to this day took $1 out of it. Basically, we did this to engage entrepreneurial community and help share stories and things like this. So we'd sort of gone into this. I'd gone into this world of the importance of social enterprise, and then we were looking about whether we should be a not-for-profit, and how do you, not having had 20 years in a big corporate basically at Nokia, and seen, there's lots of benefits working in a large corporate, but obviously the drivers for that are shareholders mainly, and it's not necessarily about the greater good. And as much as I really loved my career, I found it a bit challenging at times where you could see that it wasn't always for the benefit of the planet or the people or whatever. It was about making sure we hit those numbers so that the share price stayed the same. That's just life, So, but when I decided that I would leave what was then called my proper job to start our own business, we started to look at, right, well, how can we do things, driven by purpose, but still make it profitable, that we can look to invest in our team and our people and everything else. So now BCorps, it's about trying to accelerate like a global culture shift to redefine this success, and building like a sustainable economy, but also like an inclusive society. So, even with the people that work with you in terms of your partners, the team that works for you, setting the values and things like that. So it came from Sam basically saying, look, if we do this right and we follow the framework, we can build the foundations of a business that's going to last hopefully for decades, potentially past when, we don't want to work anymore, but it will have our own staff, our own partners and our own community wanting to invest in this because they can see that there's a greater good that will come out of this. So it was that's where the exploratory work happened. And as you start to look into it at that time, okay, BCorps were around, but it wasn't as big a sort of well-known thing. I think the other bit of this now is that with COVID, everybody has started to question why they get out of bed in the morning, a lot more, and what's their purpose, because there's been, sadly, there's a mundane thing about having to come to your own desk in your house every day and not doing that. We've seen some huge, we all know it, but there's almost like a binary: businesses are okay or businesses are doomed sort of thing about this. So I think that a lot more people are starting to explore about who they work for now and how they're looking after people and things like that. So there's definitely a wave around that. But I mean, now, off the top of my head, I think there's like 4,000 BCorps, just over, I think now. There's 153 industries, I remember that, and I think there's about 75 plus countries that are there, and everybody's sort of united to use business as a force for good. So it's pretty cool, and it's growing every day, which is amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the like one of the really good continuations from what you just said there, Phil, to Bryce, is like this concept that students graduating now actually want to know more about the business that they're working for, not just what they have on the website, but they want to know about the business. Are you finding that, Bryce?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually having similar to today. I was actually on a panel on Monday night, and I was talking to a group of students from Swinburne, and they were having a bit of a seminar series, and it was two clubs. It was the marketing and management club and the sustainability club had teamed up, and we were talking a lot about it was topics spread across a few different things, but part of that conversation steered towards what does an ethical job look like in the future, and what sort of things could these students be aspiring to do. And virtually all of them talked about the idea that that is a job that they want, that they've all sat there and said that we really do actually care about what it is that the organization does for its staff, for the community, not just for its shareholders. And I was really pleased to hear that from relatively young people sitting there saying that this is actually, it's no longer just about how much money they're willing to pay me to do a job. And a few of them were really adamant. They were asking about, one of them asked a question that was actually really quite difficult. It was a case of, if you had the choice between, like working for, and they pitched a scenario where basically it was I won't say an evil corporation, but it's one that wasn't doing an awful lot of good, and one that was doing a lot of good, but it was far more difficult to get into. Do you turn down that intermediate step or not? And it was interesting that is what they're thinking about. They've realized that because there's not that many really, really good organizations out there relative to some maybe mid-range ones, they've identified that our intermediate step for a really good future is actually working for one of those maybe not so flash ones, getting enough skills to then be able to take that and maybe do some good.
Yeah, wow. And that's a fascinating step that that our graduates are really starting to explore now. Like we need here in Australia more Patagonias. to even it out.
Right. Exactly right. And that was actually part of that conversation. Was I just rattled off a couple of different examples of organizations that are doing good things and addressing some of the environmental or social issues with the products that they were designing or services they were providing. And so many of them appear to have been born out of, probably to a degree, the frustration that no one else was doing it. It wasn't a case, it was probably a case of the job that these people wanted and the impact they wanted to make. It didn't exist and they couldn't do it respectively. So they've just gone out and made it happen themselves.
Yeah, right. And so from doing it that way, and then kind of moving into this ethical business model space as well, we're now seeing that. So I think a majority of the B Corp registered entities understand and apply like an ethical supply chain, or at least have an ethical business model in place. How does an ethical business model differ from a normal business model?
I feel like I might let Phil go first on that one, because I feel like given the journey that he's gone through to actually become an accredited B Corp, I feel like that might be a strong starting point.
Well, I think that, thanks, Bryce, but I think that one of the things is actually, what are you selling and what services there are? Okay, so the B Corp, the structure that you need to follow is about trying to find ethical partners and suppliers and things like that. So the main thing is you are only as good as the people who are supplying you or actually working with this. So it's an interesting that's probably evolving more and more at the moment is that, like say you are a manufacturer of clothing or you're doing printing, where are those shirts coming from that you're actually printing them on? So are they coming from a children's sweatshop in Asia, or are they being ethically, are they using organic cotton? What are the things that are actually your sourcing? So what it does, it gives you that peripheral vision to think about your end-to-end sort of journey in terms of your involvement in something, so to speak. So, I mean, for us, since COVID, we don't have an office anymore. There's certain things where you go, well, we did, when we had a co-working space, we worked with somebody who were also focused on sustainability and recycling and had all these different bins, and they were trying to build that. So like we're saying, okay, well, if we're going to have an office, let's work with somebody who's got the same ethics as what we have. But I say on the other side, now we've got staff everywhere in Bendigo and Ballarat, and we don't worry about these things in Portland because we don't need an office. So there's like shifts on that, but it is just looking at everybody who is part of your ecosystem and actually making sure that everybody is trying to follow the same ethical and sustainable responsibility as what you have. So it doesn't mean they all have to be a B Corp, but they need to understand about what those things do, and they're trying to change in that way.
Yeah. And I'd agree. And the clothing example is a good one, because it just becomes, it's quite a difficult space to work in, because of whenever we talk about, for example, sweatshops or some of the biggest social issues we see in any sort of manufacturing or most industries, clothing regularly comes up. And that's because we've had like the Rana Plaza collapse in, I think it was 2011 or 2013. And that really shone the spotlight on some of the really, really dark parts of the clothing industry. So then trying to sit there and set up a supply chain that is something that I'm comfortable with. It took a little bit of fine tuning, and then making sure you could actually find people that were doing the right thing. And that was in sort of 8 years ago when I started screen printing, trying to find people doing the right thing. There were a couple of organizations but it just wasn't that many. The issue that I face now is actually the trade-off between, because virtually everything I do is now B2B. I don't have much on the consumer-facing side of things. I do a few little projects here and there, but it's predominantly with other businesses. So it's actually trying to juggle their needs. So as in, it's probably no surprise because it's the same as food. If it's organic or it's made from fully recycled materials, it's a little bit more expensive. So if you're looking at getting a couple of 100 t-shirts printed, well, I should probably also, it's worth mentioning that if you were looking at getting clothes screen printed, the clothing component is actually far more expensive than the printing. So when people come to me and say, oh, we're looking at getting a couple of hundred items of clothing done, if that t-shirt costs $8 versus another brand that's going to maybe cost closer to $20 per unit, and that's wholesale, that organization, that community group, that band might sit there and say, oh, well, actually, we can't really afford that. So one of the difficult things then was actually trying to find, all right, I can't give you top tier ethical for that price, but we're going to find someone who's still pretty good. And luckily there are companies that fill that now, which it was very sort of, when I started out, it felt very black and white in that regard. And luckily there's now a sort of a more of a scale, and it's a bit easier to try and meet those needs. And also it's a really good space for just education in general. There's a lot of people I've worked for that didn't realize that that was an opportunity to do something good, as in their staff uniforms. They hadn't really thought about as an avenue they could pursue to make sure that ticks ethical boxes.
Yeah. I think the one thing, just to add, like people sometimes try to overcomplicate ethical working. It is just like, morally, do you feel this is the right or the wrong thing to do? You can all take a judgment call on whether you think that something that's happening in the world is the right or the wrong thing to do. And it doesn't take, a PhD. Not there's anything wrong with a PhD. I've always wanted to be Dr. Phil, but that's a whole different story to be surprised. But but I think that's the thing, is that even when you're aspiring to be a B Corp, as many people are, is actually doing those thoughts about, well, what's the best way to do? And that comes with transparency with your own staff and the ethics and looking after people. And, we see these all the time where people, like they're having a bad day, but they're okay to say, hey, I'd like to have a day in my PJs and just work in the background, and just being morally right, say that's okay, and understanding that. And then with your partners, we work a lot with government, with Fed and state and local councils, with the programs and the events that we build to educate people, but also with our regional growth project, which has again been like part of our purpose over profit approach to life. And again, you can see with those that, the intent is always good. So if we've got that intent to be always good with everything, then that's so important in the way that we just run businesses and behave in our daily life, really.
Yeah, and that's I think that kind of brings on the next point that I'd be keen to kind of draw out with the conversation. Sorry, Bryce, were you going to add?
No, go for it, mate.
Sorry, because that framework to be a B Corp, like you mentioned before, Phil, it's it's actually become a lot more rigorous for that point now, so that it's not just a business that's like say 12 months in operation that can go down that pathway. They can, but they need to have a lot of the kind of the rigorous data to be able to demonstrate that they can do what they say they're going to do. And 3 weeks ago, we chatted with Emma Joyce from Social Traders, who talked a lot about how their social enterprise registration process or certification process has now undergone transformation to become more of a for-purpose accreditation. The process that yourself and Sam went through with B Corp, it was time-consuming and quite thorough.
Yeah, look, it's even now, when you're coming up to your 3-year review and everything else, we're on it now, like a year ahead, and you start saying, let's do that assessment. So yeah, it's definitely not like a cramming for your last-minute exam approach to this. But again, going back to the start of our journey, by doing this, if you're at the beginning of your journey, or even, you're a bit more established, it is such a great way to actually challenge yourself on where you are in terms of this approach. And I think that was the thing with us is, and also learning from the B Corp community, who are so welcoming to stuff. We have events where there's aspiring B Corps who come, and that's brilliant, so let's share that journey. But yeah, look, I mean, it's, that the way that it's done is that you're trying to get 80 points, okay, which you can get with across a whole different range of different aspects, like we say, in terms of your ethical working in your practices and your performance, your legal, your staff. There's like a whole heap of questions that come into this. Even at the question summary at the beginning, it's like about your level of impact focus. What's the impact you want to make in the world? What's your mission? What have you got in terms of social, environmental decision making? So, like when you start this, you don't have the answers ready in a lot of cases. You've actually got to think about this. I think the one thing, as much as we've definitely grown since we started this, we were a very small company when we first did this, but we co-created our answers with everybody who was already in the organization, so that, like you're thinking about your stakeholder engagement, not just externally, but internally in terms of like, well, what do we want this to be? But then it will go through things like government structures, internal governance. So you're suddenly like starting to think about, like ethics, policies and practices. Now, we had to write a code of ethics. We had to look at financial controls, like there's like, oh, we need a policy about this, or we need a book, and go, okay, better write one then, but that's the thing. But there's lots of support and help from that. And then I think, the other thing is, there is a certain amount of financial transparency and reporting, in terms of currency, where money's being done, your earned revenue, your net income and stuff. So it's not like you've got to be a big company to do this. You could be at any. But I think that if anybody's thinking about this, going to the BCorps website and actually starting to look, there's an impact assessment that you can take. I would go and look at that as soon as possible, and actually just start to look at where the gaps are, and also the new thinking that you can have around this. But once you've got started, there's always things that we can improve on. So like since we started, we've added an employee share scheme into our business, which is something that we're passionate about. We brought in novated leases that, although they're personal, there's some advantages from the company and stuff, and went out and sourced those people for the people who wanted to do that. So there's always ways that you can build and grow, and you've got people like Patagonia to look up to, and see how they're going. They're part of the Climate Collective as well. So there's plenty of case studies and good stories about where you can do and get those points. We actually scored 83.2. We want to grow that. So we got over the line, but for a small business, we were like so happy that we got over the line. But now you start to go, okay, well, how can you continuously look to nudge that further up the actual scale?
Yeah, wow. And that, like, I'm just sensing as well that it's a process that once you kind of achieve that first, it's a 3-month kind of registration process, and then you just keep maintaining that reporting.
Yeah, 3 years. So you
3 years,
you get it, and then it comes up for renewal basically as a license. So, but it's a good way to do it, because you do. You don't never take your foot off the pedal, so to speak. You're always thinking about, well, what can we do to make that? And we've got 10 people working for us now, which still isn't very big, but we started with like 2.5, and even that transformation in terms of how long people are staying with us now. We've got people who are enjoying it. You build scales into the roles, and you try to actually accelerate people's skills and their personal development and stuff. And when you start off, you're not really thinking about that. It's almost like, well, how many hats can we wear in a day? But now we're actually trying to build that in. And then there's things as well, like trying to build an advisory board or a committee that can actually help. So you've got someone else who you can bounce ideas off and be accountable for. So we're trying to build a bit more structure in terms of those things into our business. We've always had advisors, but how do you build it in a more formal structure?
Yeah, great. And so with your with your enterprise, Bryce, are you exploring scale at the moment, or you're happy with the size?
Oh, this is a back and forth I feel like I have every few weeks with myself, to be honest. I'm at the stage now where the idea of a side hustle is great, and I fully support it. I think it's a really it's a good way to get a bit of work-life balance, even though it is a bit of extra work. But you can just be dedicating like a few hours max per week. And if it's something you're really passionate about, then you make time, and it gives life a lot of meaning. And especially if you're in the instance where you work for an organization that whatever the job or the organization is, that you can find a bit more meaning in these other things that you do. So for me, I'm mindful that it might be a little bit of time, might be a lot of time, but for the amount of work that's required of me full time, I'm apprehensive to scale up too much. But that said, what I'm looking at the minute is actually dropping a day at the university to then dedicate a day per, or I should say, start off a day per fortnight, because just the quantity of the size of the jobs and the frequency that jobs are coming in. It's one thing to sort of have a flexible day where I maybe go do some screen printing for 3 hours in the morning, come back and then work a full day at my desk for the uni. Like that works sometimes. But at the moment I've got 500 tote bags sitting in the workshop that need to be printed. I've got 10 boxes of clothing in the lounge room. I've got 2 quotes that I'm sitting on, and another message from somebody who's probably feeling a bit neglected. And so when you're sort of looking at that scale, the demand's awesome, and to have that flexibility is great, but it's also a matter of peaks and troughs, just because that's the state of things this month. Next month might look different, but there's certainly the opportunity to scale there at the moment.
Yeah, right. And so I was just listening to what both of you were mentioning with so Bryce, about how there's opportunity there, and how, Phil, you have scaled from 2 to 10. When we look at previously we were just talking about the ethical supply chain. Does that play a part in your ability to scale, or do you find locally or regionally or wherever you're sourcing your additional kind of parts from to support delivering the product or service that you both do? Is that a part of like a smooth process at the moment, or is that something else that kind of sits there, that if you've got to scale, you've got to go and kind of source someone different?
Well, I can say, like the thing for us, we build online platforms and we run events. So a lot of our partners are part of our tech stack. They're not like sort of physical people. I mean, for the Regional Growth Project, which is our collaboration that we've got with the state government of Victoria, we've got partners there. We just ran a showcase and a summit recently, and there are people like NBN Local and people like Storytowns who do geolocated podcasts for tourism, things like this. So they're all good, they're all focused businesses. But again, you do always keep aware of what the intent is. The NBN Local people are brilliant because they're all community engagement people. So they're actually looking about how they can support the businesses. So again, when you pick partners, we always try and think about whether they're the right fit and whether they're like-minded souls. And building on that, I should also say, when we pick customers, we also have the same thing. So we're always trying to work with people who have the same drivers and the same values. And we have in the past said you're not the right fit, which has cost us money, but we can still get out of bed in the morning and say, no, we're working with people who've got an intent to try and do some good in the world. So I think that it is that. But in terms of our tech stack, and especially even working when you work with government, they are also looking for like Australian-based companies and all these sort of things as well. So there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes in terms of trying to make sure that, and even where data is stored and all these challenges that you have to look at. I do sometimes envy the days of Nokia when we built stuff. You actually had something physical and you could say, well, where's that come from? But, like sometimes it's hidden, so that you have to do quite a bit of exploratory work with software and things to find the answers.
Yeah, far out. I was just laughing then because that was a challenge that I had to overcome recently about finding a data solution locally. So if anyone knows one, please pop it in the chat. It seems to be a federal government kind of procurement strategy at the moment, which is like that's great. Yeah, but I'm keen for that conversation to continue in the chat.
We'll have a chat afterwards, I think. But it is a true thing, like this sovereign sort of capability and and store the data and what country it's in. It's actually some of the bigger companies, they've struggled with that because they want the data stored in country. And it is a big challenge when you're trying to be ethical. You're trying to look at data. Like we actually work with a lot of technology companies. We run programs to help technology companies have a more human messaging and tell a better story. And they come across it all the time as well. It's like, wow, how can you still be seen to be protecting those assets which are so important to the government?
And just touching on that point as well, Phil, about I can only imagine saying no to business as being like a challenge in itself, and I've only done it a few times myself. But when things don't align with the values, like it's not that it's a better decision. It makes a lot more sense to be able to say, hey, look, guys, we're really not sure this is going to work out. Was that a tough conversation to have still?
Yeah, so I'm such a non-conflict person, and I found it really, really hard, but we've always talked about whether something's the right fit. And if that other company is true, that they would know that as well. It's more about, in the same way, we always ask people to focus on what their North Star is. So what's the long-term goal, vision that they want of their business, and more importantly, what's the impact that they're going to have? So if somebody works with you, what's the impact that there's going to be on the world, or for them as customers by you choosing them rather than somebody else? If someone can't really answer that clearly, so all these, I don't know how many startup pitches I've heard in my time of being startup pitch mentor and all the programs you run, but it's hundreds now. And if anyone said, I want to be a millionaire, or I want to buy my yacht, it was an instant, well, you're doomed. And then they go and we'd want someone to give us $250,000 to build an app or something. And I was going, well, why would I, if I had that money, give you anything where it's so that you want to make a bucket load? Because that was a few years ago, but with that intent of like, become an entrepreneur and you'll be a millionaire by the end of the year. Doesn't happen. Does for some, but even if you look at Canva, they have worked their socks off to get to where they are, and they've always tried to build values and culture, and then that resonates with your customers and stuff. So yeah, the not being the right fit, it's just being honest and open. But I think also if you look at a website of a business, not yours, Bryce, because I totally understand you don't need too much work at the moment. But generally speaking, that's like entering the front door of somebody's house. You can get a good vibe within a few seconds of whether you think this business is the right. It's what they say. It's the story they tell. It's having that hero's journey of there is a problem in the world and we're going to save it. And this is why we're really good at how we're going to save it. And this is who we're working for now. We'd love to work with you. And, that's the basis of any pitch framework that we work with people on, is to do that. You can get that right, then people come to the site and they'll probably get a vibe that maybe we're not the right ones for you as well. And it's not quite as much as the conflict, which is always handy.
And just continuing on with that topic a bit further. So with your work, Bryce, and being able to kind of source like the right suppliers, I think just recently I've seen a few garment companies kind of pop up in Gippsland, which is really exciting to see that we can actually source stuff locally now, which I think we always have been, but I think it's only once you really lower the eyes and find what's out there through the different areas that they might be located. Does that must give you hope as well with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about like clothing and clothing brands and things like that, what I've noticed is there's sort of an order that follows as things grow. As in, for example, like I'd love to see a fabric recycling facility in Gippsland, and then you could be using that as a basis for making garments. There's a couple of very successful clothing companies that have basically set up, and they won't be brands that anyone's familiar with because they just sit in the background and provide blank clothing for bigger name companies. But I'd love to have a facility like that in Gippsland that actually collects and basically imagine taking a t-shirt and just blasting it back into its original threads. That's what these machines can do. You can then you can order that by color, and then you can use those to restitch brand new clothing. And there's a couple of companies that do that, and one's called Salvage. It's based in Europe, but the quality of those clothes is actually ridiculous. I've used them for a few different companies and a few different jobs, so I made a point of ordering myself some to give it a test and see how it goes. And the way this thing is held up is just crazy. And which is interesting, given that a lot of people have a bit of sometimes a recycled item of clothing, there's negative connotations associated with that. People don't think it's going to be quite as good a quality. So anyway, this company does really good work, and I'd love to see a facility like that open up in Gippsland to then be able to service these other clothing brands and printers that are popping up. So going back to that, the order of things, it's when you start seeing more designers and more just clothing labels popping up. And in most instances, a clothing label is somebody who is doing their own designs, and they're either printing themselves or not. But there's more and more people that seem to be printing their own clothing. So as we see that sort of demand increase, that's when I'd love to see an actual clothing manufacturer step in and fill that void. And not to mention the flow-on effect that would actually have to have a facility like that, the jobs that would create, the opportunities, the diversion from landfill. Like that would actually tick so many boxes. And that's what I'm hoping to see, is that as I see more of these clothing companies start to pop up in Gippsland, I'd love to see everyone sort of team up and somehow try and make something that we could all actually use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to continue that conversation, because I think the landfill, like that challenge in itself, we're seeing the emergence of the circular economy really starting to be embraced, not just in Gippsland, like across the world. It's really taking kind of this foothold in how we reimagine waste. And in Gippsland too, there's some really cool projects that are being looked at. Better business for our local footprint. It's a statement I've heard a few times now, and I think because of the impact that we've seen with COVID, people are becoming more of kind of hyper local when they're purchasing things. Does the B Corp model and the ethical supply chain really support that local footprint to become more ethical, do you see, or are there a few challenges there with communities and not just regional, but even kind of metro communities being able to embrace this hyper local type process, or the donut economy, I suppose it's been referred to in some cases?
Do you want to go first, Bryce, or
No, you go first and I'll go second.
So I think B Corps have a key part to play in this, because they can help shine a light on the best way to actually structure and collaborate on business. So, for example, the B Corp Climate Collective that I'm on the steering committee for is and this is a global collective, but within Australia and New Zealand, it is actually companies who are actually trying to shift the dial towards net zero 2030. So we can't all have time to do one campaign and go, hey, here's a campaign, here's another campaign. So, obviously the main driver is to get the government to change their thinking, but you can influence this through government, influencing the government, influencing business, and influencing individuals. So it always makes you think about what is the ecosystem that's around you and who can support on that. But there is no way as a B Corp that we're saying, well, if someone really believes in this, then if you're not a B Corp, you're not in. And I think that when you look within local communities and with what we're doing with the Regional Growth Project, which is just about working collectively to help regional and rural businesses thrive, or communities thrive, really, it's like this halo effect, is that if you can help local businesses, we're all about SDG8 and, decent work and economic development. By doing that, they can employ more people, which then helps the social impact of the thing, which then leads to just a general halo effect of everybody being in a better space. So one thing that we always say, even if you are, say you're in Gippsland, huge place, but even if you pick it around a medium-sized town, is to actually look at who are the stakeholders locally that you need in that ecosystem, who are doing great things that can support. And then if there are gaps, then it's almost like reaching out to the wider berth of where do you find those people, a bit like you're saying about the manufacturing people or the recycling people, there might not be that many about. So the one thing that we're looking at, actually we can do a free masterclass on this part of the project later in the year, is actually mapping that ecosystem and then working out what the strengths are locally. Because if you can activate this, so once you've worked out the stakeholders, then the next bit is working out who are the proactive people. And that isn't necessarily the big companies. That could be the person who runs the local pub, you know, or the local cafe or whatever, but it's got enough drive to say, okay, let's look at what we can do together. And then you'll have the people who will follow that and they'll go, oh, I'll do it, but I'm not running this. And then you've got those laggards who aren't going to change no matter what you do. So you just like, eventually they'll get the hang of it, you know? So I think that it's using all these things and the great ethical companies that are out there as examples to inspire people. And that's with our Bridge of Growth project, with the summit, we just got local, regional, rural businesses to tell their story about how they've built businesses and how they've grown from scratch, basically, by thinking about who's around and who supports them and how they can go along that journey.
Yeah, I think like the ethical supply chain on a local level is something that has really come to light during COVID. I think that sort of hyper-local focus is something that's really popped up. And even the way Phil sort of spoke about this ecosystem that just starts to unfold, and it only really takes a handful of people to really drive that. In my local area, there was a cafe that did exactly that. And they also had great, they were very ethical in everything that they did. And that was one of the key people in actually helping me really get momentum for my business, was because they supported me. They came to me and were like, oh, hey, you're the t-shirt guy, you're the ethical t-shirt guy. What can you do in this space to help us out? And we had a really good conversation about, this is what I can provide you that aligns with your values. And those values like echoed through everything that they did. And this was somebody who identified that they were actually discouraged in the early stages of opening the cafe where they did. They said, you know, there's some bigger towns that we think you'd be more successful in, things like that. But the decision was made to support this small town that was perhaps a little bit under-resourced. And it only took that one person to really, really work hard in that space and basically redevelop the whole street. The street was really sort of struggling otherwise. But once that business built enough momentum, and that business owner managed to do that by then teaming up with every other business in the street and supporting them. It was a lot of older business owners. So the cafe owner then sort of went out and helped them with their social media, and they actually, it was a bit of, I think the word is co-opetition, where they all teamed up and they all benefited from what they managed to create. It's really disappointing that cafe didn't survive lockdown number 6, which was really, really heartbreaking. But it was an amazing example of one person stepping into that space and creating an entire local ecosystem that was actually, and supply chains that were quite ethical. And similar to Phil's point, there were people that were behind the business owner, like chanting everything that this person had to say. They really loved it. And there were people that, oh, look, I'll do it because you're doing the legwork and I like you and I'll help you out. They weren't fully invested in it, but they still made contributions to a more positive space.
There's a couple of things I just thought of. Emma Badsmale, who works for us, she's an amazing lady. She's in Portland, and she always talked about this idea that she's got is like sort of sharing the love. So if you're in a local community, in terms of marketing, if you all just liked each other's pages, and then when someone posted it, you actually shared it, you could create a little hyper-local ecosystem of everybody sharing all the good things that all the businesses, you know, you find your community groups. We've got one here where it's like Business Tuesday and everybody pummels it. But, you know, like trying to support everybody locally is amazing, you know, from that. The one example I'd really love just quickly to talk about that working is, it's called Buy From Northeast Vic. So it's buyfromnortheastvic.com.au. This is like been one of the best examples. It was an example in the summit and our showcase. There's a lady called Catherine McMillan in Benalla, who works for the local council, who came up with this idea of creating a virtual main street. So it was like, well, they, as businesses were struggling with COVID, if we can get a map, show people, so it's like Benalla and Wangaratta, Bright, just having a look here, Beechworth, Mansfield and Corriol. So if you're in Mansfield, which is particularly relevant today. I hope everybody's okay who's there as well. But if you're in Mansfield, then you can go there, and it's literally gets your shop window for all the local shops. You can go in there, buy the stuff, and they help you deliver it. And then it just grows from there. So like all the stress of if you're not great at social media or marketing, it's just basically this virtual main street. And they've got over 400 businesses on the platform now. Isimo, which is a local Mansfield company, built the platform, and now they're looking at using it as a blueprint that can be used elsewhere. So you can create these ethical local ecosystems with a little bit of help. And thank you to the state government of Victoria who gave them some funding as well, and the local councils who pitched in. But once it's going, you can see the momentum that it gains.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. That is that's a really good point. And to what you were saying as well, Bryce, it is a real pity that cafe is no longer open down Rutherglen Street there. That was a stopping point of mine. Look, I suppose the opportunities that we see moving forward, like they're there, and we've got, like Phil just mentioned, a bit of a blueprint that we can be looking at to give us an idea of how it could work for other communities, which I think is really, really important with what we do look at moving forward. As I keep hearing here in Gippsland and kind of the western part of Gippsland, that there's a big reliance on still having a lot of the products and services sold to outer suburban areas that were always the reliable markets that they were selling products and services to. And now, because that's come to a grinding halt, the pivot right now is looking at how that hyper-local connectivity can be made. And maybe, like you said there, Phil, we just have to get together and like everyone's pages, get them all onto a similar platform, and then then we can make it happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, we have got some questions that have come through, so I'm just going to read them out. I'm actually just going to see while we've got Steffi on the line to see if you can ask that question, Steffi. Just bear with me.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for this session. I really enjoyed, and I think it was great, the topics we just took in this time. Actually, I'm in the freight forwarding industry, in the global supply chain and logistics. And I like when you talk about like ethical supply chain doesn't apply to a specific industry. At the end of the day, it's gonna be in the future everywhere. So I just would like to ask, like, what do you consider are the most basic steps towards to assisting a small business and creating change? Sometimes, like in the office, we can make it more greener or become paperless. So I just would like to consider and also hear your thoughts.
I feel like that's a perfect question for Phil to answer.
Look, it's a great question. And I think that my general answer to anyone is anything is a win. Okay. So if you can like create a paperless office, which I am at home at the moment, I've created a paperless office. So I now no longer have notebooks. I have notes on my screen. I save things. We use our CRM system to take notes and stuff like that. So very, very, very rare that I ever print anything out, So if you look at that from a business perspective, doing that is one win. If you can put, if you need to have a retail space or something and you can put some solar on your roof, Patagonia is a great example. They've got so many outlet stores. They've got like over 150 on their BCorps. They're like absolute legends at this. But they have to think about these considerations about where will that store be and will it actually impact their carbon emissions and things like that. So my general thought is best thing to do, take a deep breath, think about all the opportunities you have to create change. Okay, so paper, transport, where your office, solar, everything you can think of, and then just pick like to start off with 2 or 3, you go, well, let's do those first and move along, and then say, well, how we're going. Because really, even when you're a B Corp, you pick the ones that maybe they're low hanging fruit. And, you know, like Mark Twain always said, you know, swallow your daily frog in the morning. There's always one that you want to keep putting off. So have a crack at that daily frog and see if you can get that one going as well. So I think every business is different, but I think that by just literally getting started, it's a bit like with keep cups and stuff like that. I remember having my first keep cup, and then that becomes habitual. And then having water bottles instead of plastic bottles, it becomes a habitual thing that then you can educate people on going forward. I don't know if you've got anything to build on there, Bryce.
No, I think that was a great answer. Like I love the idea of just you start anywhere that you can realistically, and you don't necessarily have to try and reinvent the wheel. It can be some really basic things that you need to try and do. Like, so for me, from a clothing perspective, it was pretty easy when I was looking at the sort of inks that I needed to be working with. It was which one is environmentally friendly, and luckily there was one specific company well known for its water-based inks versus other inks that have plastisol, which can be a little bit nasty for the environment. It's hard to clean, things like that. So for me, that was like a really simple change. And I also sit there working in a university a paperless university would be a very wild place. I struggle to imagine that just based on the way that resources and things are churned through, but that is a conversation that I've had with other people. What would a paperless university look like? And that's not reinventing the wheel. That's just picking one small element of the organization and thinking, how can we change that? So I really love Phil's idea of just anything, but yeah, to start with maybe a few easy ones, and usually momentum builds momentum. And I also think incremental change is important as well. If you try and do everything all at once, you might not be successful on all fronts, and it's less likely that the change will actually stick as well.
Yeah, you know, even with government, like government was, I think COVID obviously has not been a good thing, but it's forced a lot of people to move the dial to the right hand side and how they embrace digital and stuff. So like even in government, if you've ever been in a government building, there's still quite a few inboxes, okay, with paper in them. But when nobody's actually in the office, how do you actually get things move from minister's office to minister's office and stuff? So, you know, like even in that, it's starting to get people to embrace different ways of approaching the way they do their work. So I think that getting a challenge, you know, even like people will talk to you about their journey, get them to come in and go, well, what would you change? And what are the easy things to do and what are the harder things to do, you know?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that question. Steffi, do you have another one?
Oh no, I just like wanted to say like this was a great answer. I cannot agree more than is amazing to work in a place with purpose, with meaning, and I'm pretty sure like the customer's choice about a service of a product in the future is gonna be on base of sustainability and community engagement. And yeah, you took those topics as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for the question, Steffi. So I did pose a question to the panel as well about a shout out to a B Corp that they would like to do. I think I know which one Phil's going to do, but I did notice in the notes, Bryce, you actually you took my one. That's okay.
Sorry.
So I'm going to give a shout out to Bank Australia because I've only just recently started to explore what it requires a financial institution to do in order to become a B Corp. And there's actually a lot to really like about the model that they've been developing or that they've been building for the last decade. And I feel like I've felt a bit naive thinking, oh my gosh, they were right there in front of us. I'm pretty sure there's a branch in Morwell that I've driven past for the last decade. So they were my choice. Which one did you come up with, Bryce?
So I said Edico, which is a clothing, footwear, and sports ball company, and also made in Victoria. And they were one of those. When I say one of those companies, I mean they were the only company, and they sort of only really emerged when I was doing my PhD. So early stages of my PhD, there wasn't really any other options, and then suddenly it wasn't just a case of, you know, there was an organization roughly doing the things that I really aspired to be able to achieve in that space. They just came in just kicking goals. They really wore their, literal, like, pardon the pun, but they wore their values on their sleeves, and they achieved amazing things. And in the face of the share and football sweatshop issues that came about, I can't remember what year it was, to see Edico just straight up address that and then come up with an alternative was great.
Nice. Yep, I remember that. That's great. Thank you. And what about yourself, Phil? Which one did?
Yeah. So we use Bank Australia, just to say, give a shout out. And this is the other thing, is that if you look at the B Corp directory, you'll see it's based on the industries, and you can find B Corps that are actually that you could potentially use in your own daily life or for your own business. So that's the first thing I'd say, is have a look when you think about who your current partners are. If you're going to work with a B Corp, then you know that they're legally, looking at trying to make sure that they are truly doing things the right way. I've heard 25A, they're a great B Corp. I don't know where I came that from. Probably the one that I love the most is Who Gives a Crap. And I got to meet Simon Griffiths pretty much fairly soon after he'd sat on a toilet for 24 hours to raise his initial 50,000 to buy the toilet roll, where they basically donate 50% of their profits to developing countries to build toilets. But I love them more than anything from a marketing perspective, as also a marketer myself in my background as well as engineering, was that they have made toilet roll really exciting. Okay, so they've actually, if anybody follows their Instagram, people make Christmas trees out of toilet rolls, but they've done everything with humor, and they've built that thing in. They say thank you to the person lugging the boxes. They come up with ideas to use the cardboard boxes for your kids so you can build spaceships. So I think that they're a great one, and it's again a small change that can have a huge impact globally. I think they're wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing we didn't touch on tonight was the marketing of these B Corps. Maybe that can be a future discussion, but I feel that point you made there, Phil, around Who Gives a Crap is exactly what I live in my household right now. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Phil Orr and Bryce Magnuson for joining us on this evening's conversation around B Corps and ethical business models. Thanks very much for being a part of the conversation tonight, Phil and Bryce.
Thank you very much, and thanks to you, Scott. I think what you're doing with this series is helping people think differently, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. But I've listened to the other ones, and you're always trying to get people just to educate themselves before they action anything, and I think that's so important in today's society.
Yeah, totally agree. And thanks for having me. And I really like the idea that you're just trying to show people that things can be done differently, and these are some things to consider. It's nice to sort of see a more proactive approach. It's really good.
Cheers.